My name is Genevieve Larkser, and I'm 38 years old. My mother pulled me into the coat-check hallway of the Ashcombe Manor reception hall exactly 40 minutes into my younger sister's wedding, her fingers wrapped around my elbow tighter than necessary, and said the same 6 words she'd been saying to me at family gatherings for over a decade. "Don't embarrass us tonight, Genevieve." My father stood just behind her, arms crossed, nodding along like he'd rehearsed his agreement in the car. I asked what, exactly, I was supposed to be capable of embarrassing them with, standing there in the navy dress I'd bought specifically because it didn't draw attention. My mother's answer was the same vague gesture toward my entire life that I'd grown used to over the years. My situation. She called it the fact that at 38 I wasn't married, didn't have what she considered a real career, and had spent the better part of the last 15 years being cagey about a job she'd stopped asking about because my answers never satisfied her. Tonight, of all nights, with people like General Marcus Thorne in attendance as the groom's father and guest of honor, she needed me to simply blend into the background and let my sister have her moment. I didn't tell you had already skipped the reason my answers never satisfied her. Comment below if you've ever had to shrink yourself at a family event to keep the peace, because Genevieve was about to stop shrinking for good. The label had started early, back when I turned down a partial scholarship at a state university my parents approved of to attend a smaller college with an ROTC program instead, a decision my father called throwing away a real future at every Thanksgiving for the next 4 years. When I commissioned as a second lieutenant in Army military intelligence, my mother told relatives I was doing something with computers, unable or unwilling to explain a career path she didn't understand, and had never asked me to clarify. My younger sister, Odette, became the family's measuring stick early. She married into money by 26, threw dinner parties my mother could photograph, and never once corrected anyone who assumed my job was some vague office position. I stopped correcting my family's assumptions around year 6 of my service, partly because operational security genuinely limited what I could share about assignments, and partly because I'd grown tired of watching their eyes glaze over the moment I mentioned anything military adjacent. They knew I moved every 2 to 3 years. They knew I missed holidays occasionally, without much explanation. They filled in the blanks themselves, and the story they settled on was that I simply hadn't figured out a real life yet, an assumption easier for them to hold on to than the truth. That explaining any further would have required security clearances they'd never bothered to ask whether I had. By the time of Odette's wedding, I held the rank of lieutenant colonel, assigned for the past 3 years to a joint intelligence coordination program that required a top-secret SCI clearance, the kind of assignment where the honest answer to "what do you do" is legally limited to acknowledging the program's existence without describing its function. I'd been awarded the Legion of Merit 2 years earlier for sustained meritorious service, a commendation I kept in a drawer rather than a frame, because the one time I'd mentioned it at a family dinner, my mother had responded by asking whether it came with a raise. What my family never knew, because they'd never asked with any real curiosity, was that 18 months into that joint coordination assignment, I'd worked directly alongside a small team briefing senior officers across service branches on regional threat assessments, one of whom was a 2-star general named Marcus Thorne, who I'd sat across conference tables from more times than I could count, who knew my full service record, and who happened to be walking into my sister's wedding reception. That evening as the father of the groom, General Thorne's presence had been the subject of my mother's anxious planning for months, ever since Odette's fiancé, Weston Thorne, mentioned his father would be attending. My mother had researched him extensively online, memorized his public service record, and coached my father on how to address him properly should the opportunity arise. What she hadn't done, in all those months of preparation, was ask me a single question about my own career, or connect the dots between my repeated mentions of joint assignments and the general's well-documented decades in military intelligence leadership. I stood near the edge of the reception hall after my mother released my elbow, watching General Thorne make his way through the receiving line in his dress uniform, shaking hands, offering the practiced warmth of a man who'd spent 31 years learning how to read a room before speaking in it. I hadn't expected to see him tonight in this context, hadn't connected Weston's last name to a general I'd briefed personally on 3 separate occasions, until my sister had shown me an engagement photo months earlier, and I'd recognized the man standing beside the happy couple immediately. He saw me before I could decide whether to approach him or quietly avoid the entire situation. General Thorne's expression shifted mid-conversation with another guest, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face, and he excused himself within moments, crossing the reception hall directly toward me while my mother watched from near the cake table, with visible confusion. "Colonel Larkser," he said, extending his hand, using my rank and surname in front of a room full of people who had spent the last hour telling me to make myself smaller. "I had no idea you were connected to this family. Small world doesn't begin to cover it." I watched my mother's face change in real time from across the room, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to something closer to alarm as she processed a 2-star general addressing her supposedly unremarkable daughter by a military rank she'd never once heard applied to me. My father set down his drink entirely. General Thorne, either unaware of the tension he'd just introduced or simply unconcerned with it, asked whether I was still assigned to the coordination program, mentioned a joint briefing we'd both sat through 11 months earlier regarding a regional assessment, and thanked me, plainly and sincerely, for what he called some of the most thorough analysis he'd received in his final 2 years of active command. If you've ever watched someone's assumptions about you collapse in real time, drop a like right now. Because Genevieve's mother was about to learn exactly how much she never bothered to ask. Dinner service began shortly after, and General Thorne, seated at the head table beside his son, stood when the time came for the traditional parental toasts. He spoke warmly about Weston, about Odette, about the families joining together, the kind of toast expected at any wedding. Then, unexpectedly, he added a line that hadn't been part of any rehearsed remarks. He mentioned that he was pleased to discover, quite by accident that evening, that he already knew and deeply respected a member of the bride's family, Lieutenant Colonel Genevieve Larkser, whose work he described, carefully but unmistakably, as having quietly protected more than most people in this room will ever know. The room applauded politely, most guests unaware of the weight behind his words, but I watched my parents' table specifically. My mother's smile had frozen into something brittle. My father stared at his plate. Odette, to her credit, turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between shock and something that looked almost like the beginning of pride, though I knew better than to assume too much from a single glance across a crowded reception hall. An older relative at my parents' table, my great-uncle Reginald, leaned over during the applause and asked my father, loudly enough that I caught it from several seats away, how long Genevieve had held a rank like that, and why. He'd never mentioned it. My father's answer was a stammered mix of half-truths, something about my job being complicated and not really something we discuss, an answer that visibly failed to satisfy a man who had just watched a 2-star general praise his niece's service in front of the entire wedding party. General Thorne, still standing, seemed to notice the exchange and, whether out of genuine curiosity or a subtler awareness of the tension he'd stirred, asked my father directly whether he'd attended my commissioning ceremony, a fair enough question given the context. My father's silence stretched a beat too long before he admitted he hadn't been able to make it, an answer that was technically true and had been true for every major milestone in my career for the past 16 years, none of which he'd ever prioritized attending. Word moved through the reception the way it always does at these events, guest to guest, table to table, until the version of my life my family had spent years quietly minimizing was, for the first time, being discussed openly and accurately by people who actually understood its significance. A colleague of my father's from the country club asked him, within earshot of me, why he'd never mentioned his daughter served at that level, and I watched my father's carefully maintained image of a family with one successful daughter and one complicated one begin to crack in a way I hadn't engineered and, honestly, hadn't expected to witness so directly. My mother found me near the bar an hour later, her earlier sharpness replaced by something quieter, almost cornered. She asked, without quite meeting my eyes, why I'd never told her the full extent of what I did, and I reminded her, as evenly as I could manage, that I tried, more than once, and that her response each time had been to change the subject or reduce it to something smaller than it was. She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in longer than I could remember, neither did I need one from her. Section 9. After the wedding. Odette called me 3 days later, her voice careful in a way it usually wasn't, apologizing for something she couldn't quite name specifically, settling instead on a general acknowledgement that she'd never really understood what I did and probably should have asked more over the years. I told her the wedding wasn't the moment for either of us to unpack 16 years of family dynamics, and she agreed, though we've spoken more in the 2 months since than we had in the 2 years before it. My parents have not brought up that evening directly, not once, in the months since, though my mother did ask, almost in passing during a phone call in July, whether I might be willing to bring the General's family friend, meaning me, described in the only framework she still seemed able to process, to Thanksgiving this year, properly dressed for the occasion. I told her I'd think about it, which was more honesty than I usually managed to offer her. If your family has ever needed someone else to explain your own worth back to them before they'd believe it, you already know exactly what this moment cost Genevieve. Subscribe to Betrayal Chronicles, because the next story might be the one that finally gets you seen too. I don't know if my family will ever fully understand what those years of assignments actually meant, and I've made peace with the likelihood that some of it will always remain out of reach for people who chose curiosity too late. What changed isn't that my parents suddenly grasped classified intelligence work or military rank structures. What changed is smaller, and in some ways more significant. They've stopped introducing me at gatherings as the daughter who does something with computers and started, however awkwardly, asking real questions before assuming they already know the answer. General Thorne and I still cross paths occasionally through mutual professional circles, and he mentioned once, almost in passing, that he hadn't meant to cause a scene that evening, only to greet a colleague he respected. I told him honestly that he hadn't caused anything. He'd simply said my name and rank out loud, in a room full of people who'd spent years deciding I wasn't worth asking about, and let the truth do the rest of the work on its own.